Hi everyone. Hopefully, let's get this out of the way with. Can you all hear me? Yes, perfect. A little bit up? Yeah, we're going to do it at the start. Yeah, is that better? Awesome. I think we're good. So thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Before I begin, I want to add my acknowledgement to the lands on which I work, which are the... Is that loud enough?
Is that okay? Okay.
The lands on which I work, which belong to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge that I occupy their land both in life as well as perhaps in my death, and that we need to think about country not just when we're living but also dying. So my task today, no less, is to think about the value of dead bodies, to think about why and how they matter, in what forms and arrangements, and how that question reflects broader questions about our place in the world. And I'm going to do that by thinking through some ideas within Western secular contexts like Australia, but also in Asian and Buddhist secular contexts like Japan, where I've spent a long part of my research. You are all lovely people who have decided to come here and hear a lecture about the end and death. So hopefully I don't have to give much of a trigger warning. I think sometimes my research, I am a walking trigger warning for discussions about dying. I want to thank you for engaging in this conversation. I know it can often be uncomfortable. And I suppose I just want to highlight that I will be discussing, quite frankly and extensively, the topic of death and the stuff of dead bodies. There will be some images that pertain to death and dead bodies, but there will be no images of whole corpses or anything too confronting. But that being said, if at any time you'd like to get up or leave or look down at your phone, those options are all available to you. I won't be offended. I think you're texting somebody. That being said, please don't take any photographs of the images. Oh yes, this is me. Well, if you'd like to find me, I'll put this up again at the end, if anyone would like to learn more about the work that I do. So, before we get into the dead bodies, I want to begin with a poem. And this poem is a haiku by a Meiji-era poet and Buddhist priest, Kobayashi Issa. And Kobayashi writes, "Ronose wa ronose nagara, sari nagara." The world of dew, a world of dew it is indeed, and yet, and yet. For me, this poem speaks to the truth, but also the deep anguish of realising our ultimate impermanence. So within the Buddhist imaginary, and particularly a Japanese Buddhist imaginary, dew is a prominent metaphor that we use to describe the world that we all occupy on the day-to-day. Right? It is ultimately impermanent, ultimately subject to change. It is like the dew that appears on the grass every morning. Right? As soon as the sun rises, that world too will pass, just like all of us will one day age and die. And yet, Kobayashi wrote this poem after his young daughter had just died. She died of tuberculosis, and it was one of a number of deaths that affected him. And the "and yet" of the poem, the sari nagara in Japanese, expresses his inability to hold together those two unescapable facts. He knows that his world is impermanent. He knows that everyone, including himself and his darling daughter, will die. And yet, you can be a Buddhist master and a priest and still feel "and yet" about this ultimately impermanent world. That is the sentiment I want to hold as we think through today what we do with that which remains, the stuff that's left behind, sometimes messy, sometimes smelly, always impermanent. So we shall begin with part one, I think maybe an obvious question. Do dead bodies matter? Dead bodies are uncanny. They occupy that strange space between subject and object that both is and is no longer the person who has died. Bodies are not just matter. They are, in some way, human persons, and thus, in whatever your definition of that word is, sacred. That sacred nature means that usually we cannot just leave them to rot, and nor can we handle them through regular streams of waste disposal. Nobody's putting out the dead body with the bins, hopefully. I don't know, it's been a scary news cycle. But concern for dead body is a very much theorised and universal definition. Indeed, it's often been pinned to defining our human nature. We are a species that buries our dead. And while evidence from Neanderthals and elephants and maybe chimpanzees, what I call the kind of usual suspects of near humans, now cause us to question something of that human exceptionalism in this regard, care for the corpse remains core to the work of human culture and society. As historian Thomas Laqueur opines in the opening to his book, The Work of the dead body matters everywhere and across time, as well as in particular times and particular places. It matters because the living need the dead far more than the dead need the living. It matters because the dead make social worlds. It matters because we cannot bear to live at the borders of our mortality. Quite simply, the living, all of us, artists and non-artists, and I suspect artists more than others, are exceptionally good at making meaning from dead bodies. We have done so in very diverse ways, from mummifying and living alongside corpses, as some people do in Indonesia, the Toraja people, to cremating and scattering them in rivers, as is often done in India, to burying them in quaint English memorial gardens. However, I think that universal statements about the sacred nature of the dead go a little bit too far when we consider all of the exceptions to this claim. For one, just because dead bodies are sacred does not mean that they are not feared. There are enough folk stories of zombies and vampires and other ghouls to attest to that. And Emil Durkheim actually famously defined the sacred as that which is set apart and forbidden. Dead bodies are often, although not always, set apart from the profane world of the living because they are sacred, but also because they can be dangerous. You know, the cemetery is rarely these days in the centre of town. And it is important here to stress, before you all get too concerned, that from a biomedical perspective, at very least, dead body is not very dangerous. There's a really limited number of pathogens that can be transmitted from the dead to the living, and even then they pose a risk to embalmers and pathologists who are performing invasive procedures on dead bodies. These risks cluster around prion illnesses like Yakutsk-Creutzfeldt, viral hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, gastrointestinal infections like cholera, and things like hepatitis B and C. For example, if you were to, maybe not you, but if someone were to aspirate the lungs, there's a chance that tuberculosis could be aerolized and transmitted. But in most cases, viewing and touching and washing and being with the dead person or dead animal poses very minimal medical risk. And further, although bodies may start deteriorating quickly, if not otherwise preserved, the World Health Organization is keen to stress that dead bodies do not pose a risk of epidemic after mass death events like natural disasters. So mass graves are therefore not usually necessary for sanitary reasons. Additionally, I think as a counterclaim to this idea that all dead bodies matter, there are always been some dead who are valued more or less than others, whose personhood or humanity is affirmed or denied through the treatment of their corpse. So international humanitarian law, for example, has long focused on protecting the treatment of dead bodies in conflict situations for this reason. Specifically, let's all bring out our Geneva handbooks. Chapter 35 of the Geneva Convention pertains to the treatment of the dead, including that the dead must be disposed of in a respectful manner and their graves respected and properly maintained. Indeed, also that each party to a conflict must take all possible measures to prevent the dead from being despoiled. Mutilation of dead bodies is prohibited. Still, as we know from world news and world events, such protections are regularly disregarded. Unfortunately, I could give many examples. To give just one, the war crimes committed at Abu Ghraib by the United States Army and Central Intelligence Agency in the early stages of the Iraq War quite horrifically demonstrate what can happen when humans, living and dead, are not afforded respect. But it's not just enemy soldiers who are excluded from protections. I don't know if this is a true crime crowd. I'm always sceptical at death events if people are true crime podcasters, maybe. Okay. When Ian Brady, who is one of Britain's most infamous serial killers, who assaulted and murdered many children in the 1960s, when he died in prison in 2017, the cremation and disposal of his remains was carefully directed by the High Court in order to minimise public offence and to ensure that his final wishes were not carried out. Consequently, his cremation was conducted with no music and no ceremony, so he was forbade to have music at his funeral. And his ashes were then scattered at an undisclosed location at sea so that nobody could make a pilgrimage for visitation. Indeed, such is the offence that was caused by Ian Brady's body, his dead body alone, that several funeral homes actually refused to accept his remains. And the crematorium was deep cleaned before and after, so to ensure that no mixing of his ashes with another could occur. One extreme example. But startlingly similar prohibitions arise at the other end of the scale, when the humanity of the deceased is brought into the question because of their god-like status. And this is drawing on my work in Japan. The recently retired Emperor Emeritus, Akihito, announced his intention to be the first Japanese emperor to be cremated in several cemeteries. However, one cannot simply cremate a revered religious figure like the head of state, who some still see as a living god, at the Tokyo Metropolitan Crematorium. It is the bodies, so basically they're building a secret crematorium in the middle of the Imperial Palace, which I think is exciting. I have strange news likes. So in this way, it is the bodies of good, moral people who we recognise as human, even when we dislike them, that are deemed worthy of respectful ritualised disposal. Also, as we were just discussing, dogs, pets, cats, companion animals being more and more recognised as family members whose death should be marked. I just heard news that somebody in Sydney spent $4,000 to cremate their pet goldfish. It's very beautiful. It was laid out on a pillow with flowers and a ceremony. So I don't feel that towards goldfish, but some people do. And maybe, of course, also the other grey category now is fetuses, depending on where we decide to draw that really tricky line between the human and the non-human at the start of life. So suddenly, this neat statement that dead bodies are sacred seems rather complicated. Because further, how much of the body? Do you mean to include every toenail and bit of hair, every particle of ash from cremated remains, How do these normative ideas hold up to the day-to-day work of a mortuary or crematorium? Researching this phenomenon, Philip Olson points out that, quite frankly, not all of the body makes it through the process and is ritually disposed of as sacred waste. Something is always excluded or left behind. So Olson's work describes the processes by which... It's like I've moved into a dark spot. Hello. Okay. He describes the processes by which the body becomes made into funeral products and funeral waste. So the funeral product is the beautifully washed and dressed and perhaps embalmed and made up. These are all your choices of lipstick colour, by the way, at the mortuary. The beautiful corpse that is made up and put into the coffin for viewing and presented at a ceremony. But conversely, there's also a lot of waste that is generated, everything that does not make it to the funeral. And there is perhaps more of this than you might expect. So some of you, if you'd like to raise your hand, might have a bit of metal in your body, part of your teeth. Maybe you have a pin or gold implants or silver implants. What happens to them? Do they get scattered as ashes? Do they make it through the crematorium or into the grave? During embalming, blood and other fluids are regularly drained from the body. You might have a haircut. Somebody might wash and part your hair. You might get your hair dyed. Somebody might, hopefully, in my case, cut off and remove your bra when they're fixing you up for the end. So there's lots of things that don't make it through all the way. So we can't really say that the whole body and all of its accoutrements are sacred. I suppose one of the great urban myths in particular surrounding cremation is that cremains are collectively incinerated and mixed rather than individually processed. This is untrue. In my experience, cremation workers go to great pains to ensure that remains are individually handled with care, accompanied by a nameplate to identify throughout the whole process. But, and yet, ash is a very difficult thing to contain. Tiny particles of ash fly into the air and are lodged into the crevices of your clothes. The crem workers do not intentionally mix remains, no, but they cannot defeat the physical laws of the universe to perfectly maintain the material body boundaries between bodies. Most of your person will end up in the urn that is assigned to them, sometimes a little less. Sometimes we borrow a little ash from somebody else, from the coffin, from the clothes or the flowers. The lesson here, I hope, is that human bodies are not innately... the lesson here is that human bodies are not innately or inherently valuable. They are made so by... Ooh, I just need to stand perfectly aligned and not move. Yeah? Can I project, or is that... Yeah, maybe. Okay. I'm going to yell for a bit and see how that goes. The lesson here is that human bodies are not innately or inherently valuable. They are made so by social and cultural processes. Further, on my tippy toes works. Further, some bodies, those deemed not to be moral persons and body parts, are excluded. In some, we make dead bodies and we make them sacred. No, it's great. It's perfectly part two. This will work.
Yeah, right.
With a better mic. Excellent. What to do with a corpse? This is being recorded, so I should say, disclaimer, this is not an instruction manual for how to get rid of a dead body. Please join me for drinks afterwards for that portion of it. No. What to do with a corpse? This is Shane. This is the man that will cremate me if he's still working when I'm alive. He's a good bloke. This is totally off the cuff, but he has in his office a poster that says, "I just want to go out with a smoking hot body." Good guy. So nothing we do to a dead body is natural. Some practices like cremation appear more modern, sanitised, while others, like the exposure of the body to carrion birds, can shock and disturb. But how we react to each practice is informed by long cultural histories, social and religious norms, as well as individual preferences. Some people I talk to absolutely cannot bear the thought of being burned by flame. On the other hand, when I was travelling around Japan, people would regularly come up to me at funeral shows and say, "I hear that you just put people in the ground in Australia. You leave them to rot. How could you do that to your loved ones?" Yet others are uncomfortable with donating or comfortable with donating their bodies to medical science, where they might be preserved and displayed for decades, a fate that I thought I would do with my corpse until I started teaching medical students. They are not getting it now. I've met too many 19-year-olds. But in sum, humans are pretty creative and really rather weird. We're very weird with what we do and the we make when it comes to dead bodies, as well as with the stories, the metaphors that we tell to justify these choices. The fundamental problem, as anthropologist Matthew Engelke summarises, is putrescence. The problem is always putrescence. It's rotting away. If nothing is done, except in the coldest and driest of climates, then the body will begin to deteriorate almost immediately upon death. And to bear witness to such an act of decomposition is, for most people, abhorrent. So something must be done. This is what we call disposal. Nobody really likes this word, disposal, in relation to the human body and all of its sacred status. The preferred term throughout much of the funeral industry is disposition, final disposition, which has the benefit of sounding neutral, but is also rather obtuse and sanitised and academic. So out with it. How do we get rid of, what do we do with, how do we dispose of bodies? The simple answer is, in most places around the world, despite the vast diversity, extraordinary diversity of human culture and society throughout history, we do one of two things. It's kind of extraordinary how limited our choices are: burial or cremation. There you go, the big two. Burial is perhaps the simplest technology. This man has been a gravedigger for 55 years. This is his favourite hole that he dug, that he asked me to take a photo of. So, me. Good man. Burial is perhaps the simplest technology. A hole is dug at sufficient depth to prevent animals disturbing the remains or to prevent noxious emissions, and the body is placed inside, and then the hole is filled with dirt. Slowly, over months or years or decades, the body decays. The rate of decomposition is highly dependent on a myriad of environmental conditions, particularly the moisture and temperature. You don't want to be buried in Sydney with its water table and flooding. Cremation is also, in the end, pretty simple. Incinerate a body at a high temperature until all the organic matter, even DNA, is destroyed, and inorganic fragments and ash remain. And as I said, despite the great span of human history and the extraordinary diversity of global cultures, down in the dirt or up in flames undoubtedly remain the big two for body disposal. Now, I will say that we've kind of had an odd way to phrase it, but an explosion of new options in recent years for what we can do with bodies, new technologies to dispose of human bodies, as well as agricultural waste, as well as pets. So things like water cremation, alkaline hydrolysis, which is particularly available in Tasmania, but some states and territories throughout Australia, as well as some of you might have heard of something called human composting. perhaps, again, that's a topic for afterwards for the pub. But if any of you are gardeners or composters, you're probably experts already in that process. So there's a number of changes that are happening in both Australia and around the world. But at the end of the day, these are the two processes. Now, burial has the advantage of creating a grave, a permanent resting spot for the living to visit the dead, to lay flowers, to perhaps take up valuable real estate, according to some property investors that I've discussed this topic with. But, you know, it's somewhere that people can go for pilgrimage. Cremation, on the other hand, is what I would discuss as a kind of unfinished technology of death, because it leaves remains. And the question of what to do with ash, what to do with human bones, is a question that very much inspired by the exhibition that I've just seen, but that I want to talk about a bit more. We're just going to look at some photos of Shane as we do, because he's quite... just a bit of a warning for the next image. I do like to show it, but it is images of cremated remains. This is what you end up as. Big chunky bits of bone. Then all the metal is removed with a big magnet. The metal is usually recycled. Actually, it's often sold in Germany to an engineering firm that then makes fuselages for airplanes. So I think that's a really nice thought to think next time you're in a plane, specifically Boeing, if you're interested. Next time you're on a Boeing flight or on a holiday, just think about how many people's hip replacements you're flying in. I have a weird job, guys. You've got... Sorry, this is Shane's thing. He won't recycle because he likes it too much. These are, yeah, beautiful. This is where we end up. These are the ashes. You may get this back. Logically, this is a metropolitan cemetery in Melbourne. There's probably about a couple of thousands of sets of remains that nobody's come and picked up, that they're holding on to. Some of those are dating back to the 1960s. Contacted the next of kin and the next of kin's not interested. There is no next of kin who's identifiable, or they're just not sure about the provenance of those remains. So what do you do when you get ashes back from the crematorium? This is my favourite photo of that day, actually. I have named this section Ash Adventures. It's going to get weird. I know you think it's already weird, but it's getting weirder, everyone. Okay. People in the news keep doing very odd things with human ash. Indeed, incidents of public and sometimes opportunistic ash scattering appear with frequency in the news media, Australia, the UK, and other Western countries with very high rates of cremation. Would anyone like to guess Australia's rate of cremation? Pop quiz that I do for my students. Anyone? What percentage of Australians are cremated? 70. Ooh, pretty close. 70 to 80. We're getting up there. I think we've just probably cracked 80 this year. I want to give you some examples of some odd things that have happened as a result of our cremation boom in Australia and other countries. Get ready. On Friday the 25th of March, 2022, after the Sydney Swans AFL football player Lance Buddy Franklin kicked his 1,000th career goal, thousands of fans rushed the Sydney cricket ground in a sea of red and white. In that moment, two fans, Joel and Crystal Clayton, rushed to the centre square with one objective in mind: to scatter the ashes of Edna Dixon, their late grandmother, and a pretty passionate Sydney Swans football fan. Previously, the siblings had actually managed to pluck some of the grass from that hallowed turf of the SCG. Note the use of the term hallowed, the sacred church-like space of the football ground, and take it home and mix it with her ashes. But this was their one opportunity to scatter her remains across Centre Square. So whilst everyone else was running to try and get to Buddy Franklin to lift him up, they were running to the Centre Square, and they actually managed to scatter all of her remains. The scattering appeared joyous. It was photographed and put on Instagram, but not so much the looks on other fans around them, who appeared quite surprised at what they were doing. I could give an entire other lecture about football and death in this country, and the number of people who have scattered ashes on the MCG, Adelaide Oval, SCG combined. I should say very much against the rules and the restrictions of those institutions. I'm not condoning it, but it is a very common thing that people have admitted to us as researchers. A very small aside, but I think the football infiltration into funeral culture is quite interesting. My favourite example of this is a woman who, in her funeral instructions, requested, and that her family followed through with this request, that in the midst of her funeral, they were going to play the third quarter from the Western Bulldogs Premiership game. And so they had these songs and they had the eulogy, and then they all sat down and watched the third quarter of the Doggies win the flag for the first time in 50 years. Something about Australia and religion and death there should be talked about. Next project. This is not the only example of this, however. In June 2023, I'm sorry guys, pop star Pink was left stunned during a concert in Hyde Park in London when a fan lobbed a plastic bag of cremated remains onto the stage. She reportedly exclaimed to the crowd, "Is this your mum? I don't know how I feel about this." Finally, and unfortunately, the photo is not great, so I haven't put it up here. Last year, the Star Wars-themed Rise of the Resistance attraction at Disneyland, California, was reportedly forced to close temporarily after a patron left their relative ashes in a Dodgem car, which then unfortunately spread those ashes around the floor. Disneyland is actually particularly susceptible to public ash scattering. They have an ash detection kind of group of security staff that go around ensuring that people don't scatter their ashes, to which there is a response, which is a Reddit page which gives you various strategies about how to hide ashes in your coat and walk around Disneyland scattering them. As these examples demonstrate, there's many things that could be said about these examples, but I think we can at least say that ashes are powerful stuff. They stand in for the dead and provide a flexible resource for creative memorial practice. Because of this, famed sporting stadiums, concerts, amusement parks and national parks around the world now struggle with how to respond safely and respectfully to incidents of unauthorised ash dispersal. Ashes can become a burdensome presence for the living, who are unsure as how to handle them or how to display them. But they can also become a pretty powerful and creative statement that replaces the dead in the landscape of the living. You might be surprised to learn that it was not always so. So Alan Kelleher and his colleagues describe how the practice of taking cremated remains home, as opposed to disposing of them at a crematorium or cemetery, represents a relatively recent trend in British funerary practice and indeed Australian funerary practice, increasing from 1/10 of all cremated remains in 1974 to half in 2004 to pretty much all cremated remains today. So we didn't used to take ash home from the crematorium. We used to put it in the cemetery or the crematorium, and it's only recently that this is kind of a practice that we have. Here are the ashes, now go and do something. Do what with them? And still today, a not insignificant number of remains are never claimed from Australian crematoriums, typically because, as I said, the legal next of kin chooses not to collect them, they are not contactable, or because they no longer exist. When they are collected, and enter the space of the home, ashes may be stored temporarily as family members ruminate on next steps. They may be intentionally displayed and cared for, or perhaps they may be forgotten about entirely. These are all images from our research project called Skeletons in the Closet, which is about people who have ashes in their home. And some of you might have ashes in your home. It's an interesting phenomenon. Cremated remains, I think, can lead rather clandestine afterlives, hidden away in the nooks and crannies of Australian homes for years, if not decades, perhaps even being inherited by the next generation who's not entirely sure who those ashes actually belong to. Of course, the distinct material qualities of ash in comparison to buried dead individuals allow for extraordinary creativity in the practice of memorialisation. David Prendergast and colleagues in the UK describe this kind of important materiality of cremated remains. In the form of ash, the dead body is made portable and partable. It can be carried long distances, even across borders. It can be divided up into multiple parts. Cremation also makes an otherwise abject corpse more palatable. Ash is easy, or at least easier, to look at, to hold, to scatter, to be with, in many ways, than a corpse. In ash, the form of the dead is almost entirely erased, allowing more kind of surreptitious disposal practices to occur, perhaps even in public spaces. In Australia, it's very common, for example, for ashes to be scattered in cemeteries and crematoria, but it's also very common for them to be scattered in a public park, a backyard garden, out at the ocean. You know, if you live near the sea, it's not uncommon for people on the pier to be scattering ashes, whether or not this is actually entirely legal or regulated and authorised, questions that I'll address later if you'd like. There are, however, I think, kind of distinct practices that are emerging, in Australia at least, and I want to just talk about this briefly before I give a final example of Japan. So some ash adventures, like scattering, demonstrate a desire to place the dead in a meaningful location. Sydney Swans fan, middle of the SCG. Either because the dead really love that place or is frequently somewhere you can visit with the living. It is not necessary for the dead to also have ever visited them. So there's a growing trend in the US, for example, of course it's in the US, to shoot your ashes into space so that they can orbit Earth. Celestis Memorial space flights in the US will offer to send your ashes or even a sample of your DNA into space as a final journey, which strikes me as the start of a terrible sci-fi film about aliens getting hold of our DNA and doing something with it, but each to their own when it comes to ashes. Other ash adventures express a desire for authentic or aesthetic memorial experience. So ashes can be mixed into paint to create an artwork, or even incorporated into drones and fireworks. Go out with a bang, as it were. Finally, there are a number of memorial technologies that allow people to keep the dead close. So there's no more perhaps physical closeness than memorial tattoos, in which ashes are embedded into ink and thus the skin, or, less invasively, ashes can be pressed into diamonds and various forms of jewellery and then worn on the body. One of the more intriguing services I've stumbled upon in recent years is Inori no Shinju in Japan, which feeds, this is a little complicated, it feeds small amounts of ash into a living oyster, or several living oysters, around which a pearl slowly grows. And then after, I think it is a few months, a few years, the family comes back together to harvest the pearls that have grown around the ashes of their loved ones, creating a pearl necklace from the ashes. Again, nothing is natural or normal with what we choose to do with the dead. I wanted to end, before I open up for questions, by giving one example of what might be possible, an alternative example of what might be possible, drawn from my research in Japan and Japanese Buddhism. I think cremation and ashes are a bit of a problem for Australia because we've only recently adopted the practice of cremation, relatively recently, in our history. So in comparison to the Second World War, in comparison to my grandparents' generation, when cremation only accounted for about 30 to 40% of all Australians, we now have the vast majority of people producing ashes and being asked to do something with those ashes. And I'm kind of uncertain if we actually have the ritual and religious resources, community resources, to help us know what to do with them. One solution, or one possible solution, comes from Japan. This is Kotsubotoke, a bone Buddha. And this is a statue of the Buddha that is made of the compressed human ash of over about 10,000 sets of human remains. So what happens is that the local temple or local community will have a space where people can come and bring their ash. And this might happen over months or even years of people living and dying in that community. When there is enough ash to commission a statue of the Buddha, this is Amida Buddha, the Buddha of infinite light, a local artisan is asked to first carve a relief and then make a mould. And then the whole community comes together to fill that mould with ash. So you can see here in this community that I visited in Nagoya, they have 4 Buddhas representing over 40,000 people who have lived and died in their community. Their remains, the ashes, are actually mixed with plaster of Paris and then pressed together. This serves a very specific need and, I suppose, cultural context in Japan. One of those cultural contexts is that there's not a kind of desire to be individual or separated. You know, people are quite happy to be communally interred and communally memorialised. I talked at the start about we find it uncomfortable about the mixing of ashes, the mixing of cremains. It's not necessarily a concern in Japan, in the Buddhist context, where, of course, the boundaries between you and me in life are entirely impermanent and fictional to begin with. In death, however, if we collectively enter a bone Buddha, not only do you have a resting place, but you also guarantee that you'll be looked after. Because if you don't have descendants, and in Japan many people die without children, if you don't have children to come and look after you, then maybe one of your other roommates in death will have children that can come and offer you flowers and fruit and apples and prayers for the afterlife and a good rebirth. There are many things that people choose to do with ash beyond what is possible and beyond the SCG or some Vegemite jars. So, I realise that I'm running out of time. I want to offer a conclusion and then really just open it up to questions. I have a feeling that we all want bodies to matter. We want them to matter in death as much as they mattered in life, as more than flesh and bones, as a person. They can matter to God, they matter to your local community, to your football club, to the whole ecosystem and the cosmos. But we desperately need them to be something more. Because if we can do that, then maybe, just maybe, our body will matter too. We will feel maybe a little bit better about shuffling off this mortal coil and placing our faith in our family, our community, and death care professionals to take care of that which remains, that which we leave behind. Of course, the reality is that for better or worse, things are far more complex than universal care for universally sacred human remains. There are many people whose humanity is either ignored or actively refuted in life and in death, and the corpse is a powerful instrument for making such judgments known. Corpses are not born sacred, but they are made so, and the fragility of that status should motivate us to care for the people and systems that care for our dead. The world of dew is a world of dew indeed, and yet, there is something that remains. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Open chance to ask anything about death you've ever wanted. Yes.
I know this is good. How do you understand the shift to cremation? Like,
Yeah.
what's happening there? What's changed? Because I think about my grandparents.
Mhm.
That would have never happened.
Yeah.
And I don't know what about.
So there's a few factors that lead to this shift. So it's been building very slowly over time. So we kind of see from the 1940s until today a kind of quite a gradual rise in the rates of cremation, and there's a few contributing factors. One is cost. It's really expensive to bury somebody. It's particularly expensive in the city centre, right? So grave space, problems of grave space leads to more expensive burial. Another factor is secularisation. There are a number of religious and cultural traditions that either forbade or actively discourage cremation. Judaism, Islam, some forms of Roman Catholicism, some forms of Eastern Orthodoxy. The percentages of those populations within the general Australian population is getting smaller, even though we have immigration coming in. So there's, in some ways, if we didn't have so much immigration, we probably would have seen cremation rates rise higher in some ways. And then the other factor is kind of a bit more specific to Australia, which is interesting, and it's got something to do, I think, with what I have otherwise called Australians' necropragmatism. A bit of an odd term, but I don't care what I'll do with my body, mate. I'm not going to be there. Bung me in a hole, as a farmer once told me. This idea that maybe our bodies are sacred, but actually I don't really care what happens to them. And some historians would argue that there's lots of factors, one being our experience of World War II, where most of our dead died and were left in Europe, right? They didn't come home. Very different to the US, where all of the bodies were brought home and they were embalmed, and they have this culture of really fixating the corpse. In Australia, we don't necessarily have so much of that focus. So lots and lots of different factors. We think probably at the moment cost is the number one. Cost and secularisation are the kind of two big factors that are leading to the rise in cremation in Australia. I don't know if we'll ever get over 80 to 90%. I think there'll probably be a roof, because there are just some communities that never want to cremate. And I don't think that's going to change. Yeah. Great question. Yes?
Have you looked at deaths and funerals in Ireland?
Oh, yes. Well, I haven't personally, but quite famous, I suppose, as an example within death studies, right, is the Irish wake. And the way, that beautiful fact that we always say is that the reason we call it a funeral parlour is because the parlour is the front room of your house, right? And the tradition, particularly in Ireland, that remains to this day is to have the body at home in the parlour and displayed, but also for there to be a wake that is both mournful and joyful, right? That is a celebration as well as great deep mourning. A tradition that we see in other parts of the world, but perhaps never done better than by an Irish wake, right? And if you've ever had the opportunity to line the streets as a coffin passes by in an Irish community, then you would know the power of that coming together. It's really interesting because Irish mourning traditions are often held up as an example of a really strong death culture that kind of has survived secularisation and maybe professionalisation of the funeral industry. The kind of sanitisation, it's still done by family in Ireland. And in many Irish Australian communities, it should be said as well. Yeah. It's beautiful.
I went to a funeral recently at a close friend, and it was a wake.
Yeah.
But they never had her there. And
Yes.
I found that quite disturbing. But because it's all these people hanging around, it's like all on board. It was said it was a wake, but it didn't have a sense of me because she was.
Can I ask, were there ashes there, or was there no body or no ashes at all?
No, there was ashes, but there was nothing. She was cremated.
Oh, but the ashes weren't at the funeral.
No.
No, yeah, interesting. So yes, this is another trend. The big trend that's kind of happening is what we would call the disaggregation of the disposal, there's that lovely word, of the body, the handling of the body from the celebration. And increasingly what's happening is people are, for many reasons, because they want to be more involved perhaps, because they don't want to pay money, asking professionals to handle the body, the handling of the body, the disposal of the body, it's a burial or cremation or whatever, and then let's all go to the pub and celebrate afterwards. And that's going to be our funeral or wake or whatever we want to call it, celebration of life, memorial. And that can be quite challenging to some people, perhaps also if you don't get the opportunity to say goodbye to the body, either when the person is still alive, when they're dying, or afterwards through viewing. But it certainly is something we see emerging more and more across in Australia, right? That this is sometimes called this thing called direct cremation, which is we'll have a funeral, but we'll organise that. Can you just have our person cremated and we'll get the ashes back and then we'll do something later. And yeah, it's interesting to say that you hear that you felt that was dissociating.
A couple of days before she died, I wasn't like, but
Yeah,
she died and I never
yeah.
get how I felt.
No, I mean, and it's interesting as well. Maybe I think it's also possibly partially that kind of idea that for many Australians have had an experience of not having bodies at funerals because of our experience of fighting wars overseas, and often the bodies don't come back. It's really notable, for example, if you go to a lot of country towns in Australia, there's an epitaph to the war dead, right? Very normal. Epitaphs to the war death with no graves. There's no body around those, right? Whereas if you go to a war memorial in many parts of Europe, often they're centred around graves because there are bodies to be centred around. Whereas, you know, it's the absence of the bodies, the absence of the mostly young men who were taken in life and then never returned in death that epitaph stands for. And so it's kind of this interesting idea that maybe Australia has a bit of a bodiless death culture. And then again, we have ashes though. What can be the power of those ashes to bring the dead back into life? Maybe not in the centre pitch of the football ground, but in some way that's appropriate. Yeah. Yes.
Was there a catalyst in your young life to
Why am I? Yes. Yes. So I started off as a scholar of religion, and I never thought I would. I think death is fascinating, but it was always something I didn't really understand. And my dad died when I was 22, 23. I was just about to begin my kind of academic studies. And I think, many people do many things when something big like that happens to them. I think maybe a classic academic response is, great, I'll do a PhD in that. That's how I'm going to understand it a bit more. And I think that's the interesting thing about grief, is because it's so unassailable, right? There's this idea that it's very hard to explain the experience of grief to somebody who hasn't grieved, who hasn't been a griever. And so once you step into that other world, that other country, suddenly I became more interested in figuring out what that was and how to explain it to people and how to communicate that to people. It sounds odd to say, but people keep dying. There seems to be more work to be done. I'm never finished in trying to understand it. It seems to be the question that motivates not just Buddhism and religion, but almost every aspect of our lives. So what a good question, to stay with. Yeah.
A lot of people die in hospital.
Yes.
And care homes. So when you do a PhD, they're institutions, and I'm not too sure whether people, if they had a choice, would choose that.
Yes. So here's the rallying call. 70% of Australians say that they would like to die at home. 14% of Australians die at home. We have more institutionalised death as a percentage than Ireland, than New Zealand, than Canada. Even, I know this breaks our Aussie hearts, we're losing to the US in this one. So Australian death is incredibly institutionalised. We don't really necessarily want to die in institutions, but we end up doing it. I don't think that institutional death has to be bad, right? I don't think it's necessarily all hospital deaths are bad deaths. And that, institution includes aged care home and it also includes hospice, okay? And, for some people who have been in an aged care home for 20 years, maybe that is their quote unquote home. So it's not necessarily a bad death, but we are not, as a society, providing enough resources to allow people to die where they want to die. And we're particularly failing at in-home hospice care, right? Providing people with nurses, with beds, with skills to be able to care for the dying. Certainly there are some communities in Australia that do this better, that keep their people at home, but a lot of people don't get to die where they want to die. Now, you might want to die in an institution. I'm saying this is not necessarily a bad choice. I don't know if I'd like to die at home. Maybe I want to die with medical professionals, that could be your choice. But we are very bad at allocating resources to this in Australia. As I always kind of say, the dead make for very bad lobbyists. There's not a lot of votes in death care. There should be, because guess what? Death and taxes, the two things that actually bring us all together. Many more things. But yeah, we haven't been able to significantly advocate well enough for supporting people to die where they'd like to die in Australia. Sorry for the rant, it's a real problem. We're fighting a war on many fronts in this space of research. Yeah. Yes?
On the increase of cremations,
yes.
Previous prohibitions, my parents were strict Catholics, and before Vatican II, I can remember as a young Catholic boy learning about things, hearing about cremation and being told that Catholics were forbidden from doing it because it was the resurrection.
Yeah. So this is the other factor I should have said. So Australia is not, according to the last census, a majority Christian country. We are a minority Christian country by data, but the largest population of Christians in Australia are Catholic, right? So we're more Catholic as a Christian population than other countries in the world. Very big difference with England, for example. And this was actually affected a number of Australians' ideas about cremation, right? So cremation initially was outlawed is not the right word, but it was advised against for Catholics, for practicing Catholics. And then in 1972, the prohibition was lifted and cremation was therefore allowed. However, the ashes had to be kept together in one spot and should not be scattered. They should be placed on a mantelpiece, right? Kept together so that they could be venerated. More recently, the Vatican has come out in recent years and said, actually, we do recognise that you might want to split those ashes or might keep a little bit of them and put some of them in a cemetery or columbarium. And that's another change, I suppose, as a kind of loosening of the laws, as it were, regarding cremation. But that's another reason, I suppose, why we saw that uptick in cremation post the Vatican decision. But it's not universal. I mean, it's really interesting to think about this. It's just so different around the world. There is no crematorium in Malta. You cannot be cremated in Malta, everyone. There are some countries that, Malta, I think, outlawed cremation until 2012, right? Whereas you must be cremated in Singapore. You have to be. Japan, where I've done work, has a 99.97% cremation rate. So it's not just about what people wish to do, it might also be about what they're forced to do. And what they can afford, which I don't think we like to think about death as really pragmatic, but often it is very pragmatic about the choices we can make. And that's fine. The last thing I'd like to do is make people feel guilty about the choices they have to make about death, because same thing. Yes?
Also another comment, I spent a week in Varanasi
Ooh.
some years ago. I was actually living right on the edge of the Ganges.
Yeah.
And the first of the open cremation, a little bit, and I was across the river from it because it was within a Hindu area if I was native, and I was doing a drawing in a journal, and I was surrounded by kids who were far more interested in the drawing than in the fact that a body was being across the way. And
It's very normal.
and then it felt so normal,
Yeah.
as opposed to here. And then when I was in Varanasi, I can remember one morning having tea with having his cup of tea, invited to have a cup of tea with the person who had family rights to this particular spot. And the body was almost burnt, so it had been pushed into the centre, and already on the warm ground were 2 cows and a dog appreciating the warmth. And I thought it was just so natural.
Yeah.
And I wished we did that in Australia.
Yeah.
The lack of mystery, even though it was treated seriously, you
Yeah.
know, the older son doing this and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But the simplicity and directness of it was quite profound.
Yeah, I love that story about the dogs and the cows finding warmth in the cremation spot. Isn't that quite lovely? Yes, open pyre cremation or open. So all crematoriums in Australia are industrial crematoriums. You can still go and visit them and say hi to your local Shane, lovely man. I'm sure he'll, say hi to you and shake his hand. And say, will you cremate me? But yeah, there's a real lack of connection there. And most people I talk to don't really visit crematorium or cemeteries unless they have a reason to be there. The vast majority of us will only ever, if we're very lucky, have to organise 2 funerals. Maybe one for your mum, maybe one for your dad, if you're lucky, right? If you don't come from a community where death is more prevalent or forced upon you. It's quite interesting to say the open pyre cremation. There is one community in Arizona in the US that's actually argued for and has now legalised a community funeral pyre. So they have a open air funeral pyre in their community that they all come together and they chop down the wood and they come together and they cremate people together in their community in an open funeral pyre. So there are ways of doing this if that wanted to be legalised. It would be quite a big legal change, but certainly I've actually heard of some communities, Hindu communities, calling for that to be legalised in Victoria within certain areas as well. So yeah, but this is just, I think more broadly what you're saying is the kind of sanitisation of death, right? The hiding of death behind hospital doors and aged home doors and crematorium doors so that you don't see it very much. You don't have to think about it, right? And if you don't think about it, maybe you'll live forever. No, unfortunately, that's not how it works. But, it's one of those nice little immortality myths that we carry around with us day to day so that we don't all have to think about our pending mortality until you come here and I remind you all. But that's my job. Any other questions?
It's great. One message that I was here is when dying is almost for the others.
Dying? Yes. Oh, I heard about this. I was just reading something the other day that dying happens to other people.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Beautiful. I love that. I love a good epitaph, a funny epitaph. If you're ever in a cemetery, that's what I get my students to do. I teach death dying at Uni Melbourne now, and one of the things is they all have to go and walk through a cemetery and find their favourite gravestone. And it's pretty funny. Some of them are really, really funny. Spike Mulligan's famous one, "I told you I was ill." Or there's all these kind of classic ones. I think it's really funny because you can't choose your neighbours in a cemetery all the time. And my very lovely grandfather's Salvation Army Christian modest grave is 2 doors down, as it were, from this one that has a massive Satan imagery and says, I don't know if my maker's ready to meet me, but I'm going to come and get him or something. It's just, you know, a nice sense of community and spirit at the end in the cemetery. Yeah. Thank you all for smiling and laughing about death. It's been great.